Today I'm going to be reading from a book called Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology at the End of the World, written by Tim Morton, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. It's a little bit heady, but it's not really academic philosophy, so I think I'll be reading at the very least the first chapter of it. It's an important concept. It's worth checking out. A Quake In Being, an Introduction to Hyperobjects. In the ecological thought, I coined the term hyperobjects to refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. A hyperobject could be a black hole. A hyperobject could be the Lago Agrio oil field in Ecuador or the Florida Everglades. A hyperobject could be the biosphere or the solar system. A hyperobject could be the sum total of all the nuclear materials on Earth, or just the plutonium or the uranium. A hyperobject could be the very long-lasting product of direct human manufacture, such as styrofoam or plastic bags, or the sum of all the whirring machinery of capitalism. Hyperobjects then are quote-unquote hyper in relation to some other entity, whether they are directly manufactured by humans or not. Hyperobjects have numerous properties in common. They are viscous, which means that they quote-unquote stick to beings that are involved with them. They are non-local. In other words, any, quote, local manifestation, unquote, of a hyperobject is not directly the hyperobject. They involve profoundly different temporalities than the human scale ones we are used to. In particular, some very large hyperobjects, such as planets, have genuinely Gaussian temporality. They generate space-time vortices due to general relativity. Hyperobjects occupy a high-dimensional phase space that results in their being invisible to humans for stretches of time, and they exhibit their effects interobjectively. That is, they can be detected in a space that consists of interrelationships between aesthetic properties of objects. The hyperobject is not a function of our knowledge, it's hyper-relative to worms, lemons, and ultraviolet rays as well as humans. Hyperobjects have already had a significant impact on human social and psychic space. Hyperobjects are directly responsible for what I call the end of the world, rendering both denialism and apocalyptic environmentalism obsolete. Hyperobjects have already ushered in a new human phase of hypocrisy, weakness, and lameness. These terms have a very specific resonance in this study, and I shall explore them in depth. Hypocrisy results from the conditions of the impossibility of a meta-language, and as I shall explain, we are now freshly aware of these conditions because of the ecological emergency. Weakness from the gap between phenomenon and a thing, which the hyperobject makes disturbingly visible, and lameness from the fact that all entities are fragile as a condition of possibility for their existence. And hyperobjects make this fragility conspicuous. Hyperobjects are also changing human art and experience, the aesthetic dimension. We are now in what I call the age of asymmetry. Hyperobjects are not just collections, systems, or assemblages of other objects. They are objects in their own right, objects in a special sense that I shall elucidate as we proceed through this book. The special sense of object derives from object-oriented ontology, or OOO, an emerging philosophical movement committed to a unique form of realism and non-anthropocentric thinking. Least of all, then, would it be right to say that hyperobjects are figments of the human imagination, whether we think imagination as a bundling of associations in the style of Hume, or as the possibility for synthetic judgments a priori with Kant. Hyperobjects are real whether or not someone is thinking of them. Indeed, for reasons given in this study, hyperobjects end the possibility of transcendental leaps, quote, outside, unquote, physical reality. Hyperobjects force us to acknowledge the immanence of thinking to the physical, but this does not mean that we are, quote-unquote, embedded in a quote-unquote life world. Hyperobjects thus present philosophy with a difficult double task. The first task is to abolish the idea of the possibility of a meta-language that could account for things while remaining uncontaminated by them. For reasons I shall explore, post-structuralist thinking has failed to do this in some respects, or rather it didn't complete the job. The second task is to establish what phenomenological quote-unquote experience is in the absence of anything meaningfully like a quote-unquote world at all. Hence the subtitle, quote, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, unquote. I have divided this book into two parts, since there is a radical split between the object and its appearance. For some other entity, it seems appropriate to divide the book in this manner. Hyperobjects require direct, philosophical, historical, and cultural explication, and this suits the first part of the book. But then we must move on to the human appropriation of hyperobjects, which occupies the second part. Throughout Hyperobjects, I frequently write in a style that the reader may find quote-unquote personal, sometimes provocatively or frustratingly so. The decision to write somewhat quote-unquote personally was influenced by Alfonso Lingis's risky and rewarding phenomenology. It seems appropriate. I am one of the entities caught in the hyperobject I here call global warming. Another decision, I don't subscribe to calling it climate change. See Figure 1. One of the entities I know quite well, and as an object-oriented ontologist, I hold that all entities, including quote-unquote myself, are shy, retiring octopuses that squirt out a dissembling ink as they withdraw into the ontological shadows. Thus, no discourse is truly quote-unquote objective, if that means that it is a master language that sits quote-unquote meta to what it is talking about. There is also a necessarily iterative, circling style of thought in this book. This is because one only sees pieces of a hyperobject at any one moment. Thinking them is intrinsically tricky. This line of reasoning makes me seem like a postmodernist, though for reasons that will become clear, the emerging ecological age gets the idea that, quote, there is no meta-language, unquote, much more powerfully and nakedly than postmodernism ever did. Since for postmodernism, quote, everything is a metaphor, unquote, in some strong sense, all metaphors are equally bad. But since for me, and indeed for all humans as we transition into the age of asymmetry, there are real things for sure, just not as we know them or knew them. So, some metaphors are better than others. Yet because there is nowhere to stand outside of things altogether, it turns out that we know the truth of, quote, there is no meta-language, unquote, more deeply than its inventors. The globalizing sureness with which, quote, there is no meta-language, unquote, and everything is a metaphor are spoken in postmodernism means that postmodernism is nothing like what it makes itself to be, and it is indeed another version of the white, Western male historical project. The ultimate goal of this project, it seems, was to set up a weird transit lounge outside of history in which the characters and technologies and ideas of the ages mill around in a state of mild, semi-blissful confusion. Slowly, however, we discovered that the transit lounge was built on Earth, which is different from saying that it was part of nature. Throughout this book, I capitalized nature precisely to, quote, denature, unquote, it, as one would do to a protein by cooking it. The actual Earth, as Thoreau puts it, now contains throughout its circumference a thin layer of radioactive materials deposited since 1945. The deposition of this layer marks a decisive geological moment in the Anthropocene, a geological time marked by the decisive human, quote, terraforming, unquote, of Earth as such. The first significant marks were laid down in 1784 when carbon from coal-fired industries began to be deposited worldwide, including in the Arctic thanks to the invention of the steam engine by James Watt. The birth of the steam engine, an all-purpose machine whose all-purpose quality, as noted in its patent, was precisely what precipitated the industrial age, was an event whose significance was not lost on Marx. This universal machine, uncanny harbinger of the computer, an even more general machine, could be connected to vast assemblages of other machines to supply their motive power, thus giving rise to the assemblages of assemblages that turn the industrial age into a weird cybernetic system, a primitive artificial intelligence of a sort. To wit, industrial capitalism with the vampire-like downward causality of the emergent machine level with its related machine-like qualities of abstract value, sucking away at the humans on the levels beneath. After 1945, there began the Great Acceleration, in which the geological transformation of Earth by humans increased by vivid orders of magnitude. Yet, like everyone else until about a decade ago, Marx missed the even bigger picture. Think about it. A geological time, vast, almost unthinkable, juxtaposed in one word with very specific immediate things. 1784, soot. 1945, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, plutonium. This is not only a historical age, but also a geological one. Or, better, we are no longer able to think history as exclusively human for the very reason that we are in the anthropocene. A strange name indeed, since in this period non-humans make decisive contact with humans, even the ones busy shoring up differences between humans and the rest. The thinking style, and thus the writing style that this turn of events necessitates, is one in which the normal certainties are inverted, or even dissolved. No longer are my intimate impressions quote-unquote personal in the sense that they are merely mine or subjective only. They are footprints of hyperobjects, distorted as they always must be by the entity in which they make their mark. That is, me. I become, and so do you, a litmus test of the time of hyperobjects. I am scooped out from the inside. My situatedness, and the rhetoric of situatedness in this case, is not a place of defensive self-certainty, but precisely its opposite. That is, situatedness is now a very uncanny place to be, like being the protagonist of a Wordsworth poem or a character in Blade Runner. I am unable to go beyond what I have elsewhere called ecomimesis, the often first-person rendering of situatedness, quote, in, unquote. This is not to endorse ecomimesis, but to recognize that there is no outside, no meta-language. At every turn, however, the reader will discover that the prose in this book sways somewhat sickeningly between phenomenological narrative and scientific reason. Yet just as I am hollowed out by the hyperobject, so by the very same token the language of science is deprived of its ideological status as cool impersonality. The more we know about hyperobjects, the stranger they become. Thus, hyperobjects embody a truth about what I once thought only applied to life forms, the truth of the strange stranger. What this book seeks, then, is a weird ecomimesis that tugs at the limits of the rhetorical mode, seeking out its hypocrisy. For reasons I give later, the term hypocrisy is very carefully chosen. The time of hyperobjects is a time of hypocrisy. Yet, for the same reason, seeking out hypocrisy cannot be done from the point of view of cynicism. If there is no meta-language, then cynical distance, the dominant ideological mode of the left, is in very bad shape, and will not be able to cope with the time of hyperobjects. There is a further reason why Alfonso Lingis is central to this project. Lingis's book, The Imperative, is a remarkable reworking of Kantian ethics, taking phenomenology into account. The phenomenology in question is Lingis's own, developed from years of study and affiliation with Emmanuel Levinas, and very different from the Husserlian phenomenology that is its great-grandparent. In particular, Lingis makes it possible to think a truly ecological ethics. Many of his most potent examples are drawn from ethical dilemmas concerning ecological action. In the later sections of this book, contained in Part 2, quote, The Time of Hyperobjects, unquote, I explore in depth why a Lingis-inspired view of ethics is essential for ecological action. In particular, the section entitled Hypocrisies deals extensively with Lingis's thought. Hyperobjects are what have brought about the end of the world. Clearly, planet Earth has not exploded, but the concept world is no longer operational, and hyperobjects are what brought about its demise. The idea of the end of the world is very active in environmentalism, yet I argue that this idea is not effective, since, to all intents and purposes, the being that we are supposed to feel anxiety about and care for is gone. This does not mean that there is no hope for ecological politics and ethics. Far from it. Indeed, as I shall argue, the strongly held belief that the world is about to end, quote, unless we act now, unquote, is paradoxically one of the most powerful factors that inhibit a full engagement with our ecological coexistence here on Earth. The strategy of this book, then, is to awaken us from the dream that the world is about to end because action on Earth, the real Earth, depends on it. The end of the world has already occurred. We can be uncannily precise about the date on which the world ended. Convenience is not readily associated with historiography, nor indeed with geological time, but in this case, it is uncannily clear it was April 1784 when James Watt patented the steam engine, an act that commenced the depositing of carbon in Earth's crust, namely the inception of humanity as a geophysical force on a planetary scale. Since for something to happen, it often needs to happen twice, the world also ended in 1945 in Trinity, New Mexico, where the Manhattan Project tested the gadget, the first of the atom bombs, and later that year, when 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Figure 2. These events mark the logarithmic increase in the actions of humans as a geophysical force. They are of, quote, world historical, unquote, importance for humans, and indeed for any life form within range of the fallout, demarcating a geological period, the largest scale terrestrial era. I put, quote, world historic, unquote, in quotation marks because it is indeed the fate of the concept world that is at issue. For what comes into view for humans at this moment is precisely the end of the world, brought about by the encroachment of hyperobjects, one of which is assuredly Earth itself, and its geological cycles demand a geophilosophy that doesn't think simply in terms of human events and human significance. The end of the world is correlated with the anthropocene, its global warming and subsequent drastic climate change whose precise scope remains uncertain while its reality is verified beyond question. Throughout Hyperobjects, I shall be calling it global warming and not climate change. Why? Whatever the scientific and social reasons for the predominance of the term climate change over global warming, for naming this particular hyperobject, the effect in social and political discourse is plain enough. There has been a decrease in appropriate levels of concern. Indeed, denialism is able to claim that using the term climate change is merely the rebranding of a fabrication, nay, evidence of this fabrication in flagrante delicto. On the terrain of media and the socio-political realm, the phrase climate change has been such a failure that one is tempted to see the term itself as a kind of denial, a reaction to the radical trauma of unprecedented global warming. That the terms are presented as choices rather than as a package is a symptom of this failure, since logically it is correct to say, quote, climate change as a result of global warming, unquote, where quote, climate change, unquote, is just a compression of a more detailed phrase, a metonymy. If this is not the case, then climate change as a substitute for global warming is like cultural change as a substitute for Renaissance, or change in living conditions as a substitute for Holocaust. Climate change as substitute enables cynical reason, both right-wing and left, to say that the climate has always been changing, which to my ears sounds like using people have always been killing one another as a fatuous reason not to control the sale of machine guns. What we desperately need is an appropriate level of shock and anxiety concerning a specific ecological trauma. Indeed, the ecological trauma of our age, the very thing that defines the Anthropocene as such. This is why I shall be sticking with the phrase global warming in this book. Numerous philosophical approaches have recently arisen as if in response to the daunting, indeed horrifying coincidence of human history and terrestrial geology. Speculative realism is the umbrella term for a movement that comprises such scholars as Graham Harman, Jane Bennett, Quentin Meillassoux, Patricia Clough, Ian Hamilton Grant, Levi Bryant, Ian Bogost, Stephen Shaviro, Reza Negarestani, Ray Brassier, and an emerging host of others such as Ben Woodward and Paul Ennis. All are determined to break the spell that descended upon philosophy since the Romantic period. The spell is known as correlationism, the notion that philosophy can only talk within a narrow bandwidth restricted to the human world correlate, meaning it is only possible between a human mind and what it thinks, its, quote, objects, unquote, flimsy and tenuous as they are. The problem as correlationism sees it is the light on in the fridge when you close the door? It's not quite idealism, but it could tend that way. But the problem goes back further than the Romantic period, all the way back to the beginning of the modern period. Unlike Latour, I do believe that we have, quote, been modern, unquote, and that this has had effects on human and non-human beings. The restriction of philosophy's bandwidth attempts to resolve a conundrum that has been obsessing European thinking since at least the uncritical inheritance by Descartes of the scholastic view of substances, that they are basic lumps decorated with accidents. Despite his revolutionary rationalism, brilliantly deriving reality from his confidence in his doubting mental faculties, Descartes uncritically imported the very scholasticism his work undermined, imported it into the area that mattered most, the area of ontology. Since then, even to say the word ontology has been to say something with a whiff of scholasticism about it. Epistemology gradually took over. How can I know that there are or are not real things? What gives me or denies me access to the real? What defines the possibility of access? The possibility of possibility? These thoughts even affect those who strove against the trend, such as Schelling and Heidegger, the original phenomenologists, whose slogan was, quote, "to the things themselves," unquote. Speculating outside of the human became a minor trend, exemplified by the marginalization of Alfred North Whitehead, who thanks to speculative realism has been enjoying a recent resurgence. Speculative realism has a healthy impulse to break free of the correlationist circle, the small island of meaning to which philosophy has confined itself. It is as if, since the 17th century, thinking has been cowed by science. Yet science not only cries out for quote-unquote interpretation, and heaven knows some defenses of the humanities these days go as far to argue that science needs the humanities for PR purposes. Beyond this, science doesn't necessarily know what it is about. For a neo-Darwinist, reality is mechanisms and algorithmic procedures. For a quantum physicist, things might be very different. Reality might indeed entail a form of correlationism. The Copenhagen interpretation is just that. Or everything is made of mind. So what is it? Which is it? Asleep at the switch, philosophy has allowed the default ontology to persist. There are things which are basically featureless lumps, and these things have accidental properties like cupcakes decorated with colored sprinkles. This thinking, or the lack thereof, is not unrelated to the eventual manufacture, testing, and dropping of Little Boy and Fat Man. Epistemological panic is not unrelated to a sclerotic syndrome of, quote, burying the world in nullity in order to prove it, unquote. This thinking still continues despite the fact that thought has already made it irrelevant. The thinking reaches the more than merely paradoxical idea that if I can evaporate it in an atomic energy flash, it must be real. The thinking is acted out daily in drilling and now quote-unquote fracking for oil. The year 1900 or thereabouts witnessed a number of quote-unquote prequels to the realization of the Anthropocene and the coming of the Great Acceleration. These prequels occurred within human thinking itself, but it is only in retrospect that humans can fully appreciate them. Quantum theory, relativity theory, and phenomenology were all born then. Quantum theory blew a big hole in the idea of particles as little ping-pong balls, Relativity theory destroyed the idea of consistent objects, things that are identical with themselves and constantly present all the way down. Both theories will be discussed at length in later sections. Extreme forms of realism in narrative began to set streams of consciousness free from the people who were having them, and the hand-holding benevolent narrator vanished. Monet began to allow colors and brushstrokes to liberate themselves from specific forms, and the water in which the water lilies floated, exhibited on the curving walls of the orangery, became the true subject of his painting. Expressionism abolished the comforting aesthetic distances of Romanticism, causing disturbing, ugly beings to crowd towards the viewer. What did the, quote, discoveries of 1900, unquote, have in common? Water, quanta, space-time began to be seen. They were autonomous entities that had all kinds of strange, unexpected properties. Even consciousness itself was no longer just a neutral medium. Phenomenology made good on the major philosophical discovery of the Romantic period, the fact of consciousness that, quote-unquote, has a content of some kind. Monet had started painting water lilies, or rather, he had started to paint the space in which water lilies float, or rather, he had started to paint the rippling, reflective object in which the lilies float, the water. Just as Einstein discovered a rippling, flowing space-time where previously objects had just floated in a void, Monet discovered the sensuous spaciousness of the canvas itself. Just as later Tarkovsky was to discover the sensuous material of film stock. All this had been prefigured in the Romantic period with the development of blank verse narratives, meandering through autobiographical detours. Suddenly a whole lot more paper was involved. Around 1900, Edmund Husserl discovered something strange about objects. No matter how many times you turned around a coin, you never saw the other side as the other side. The coin had a dark side that was seemingly irreducible, and this irreducibility could easily apply to the ways in which another object, say, a speck of dust, interacted with the coin. If you thought this through a little more, you saw that all objects were in some sense irreducibly withdrawn. Yet, this made no sense since we encounter them every waking moment, and this strange dark side applied equally to the, quote, intentional objects, unquote, commonly known as thoughts, a weird confirmation of the Kantian gap between phenomenon and thing. Kant's own example of this gap is highly appropriate for a study of hyperobjects. Consider raindrops. You can feel them on your head, but you can't perceive the actual raindrop in itself. You only ever perceive your particular anthropomorphic translation of the raindrops. Isn't this similar to the rift between weather, which I can feel falling on my head, and global climate, not the older idea of local patterns of weather, but the entire system? I can think and compute climate in this sense, but I can't directly see or touch it. The gap between phenomenon and thing yawns open, disturbing my sense of presence and being in the world, but it is worse still than even that. Raindrops are raindroppy, not gumdroppy, more's the pity. Yet raindrop phenomena are not raindrop things. I cannot locate the gap between phenomenon and thing anywhere in my given phenomenal, experiential, or indeed scientific space. Unfortunately, raindrops don't come with little dotted lines on them and a little drawing of scissors saying, quote, cut here, unquote. Despite the insistence of philosophy from Plato up until Hume and Kant that there is some kind of dotted line somewhere on a thing, and that the job of a philosopher is to locate this dotted line and cut carefully. Because they so massively outscale us, hyperobjects have magnified this weirdness of things for our inspection. Things are themselves, but we can't point to them directly. This has been the first half of the first chapter of Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, written by Timothy Morton, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Thanks for reading along with me. Stay tuned for the next part.